Edition here of Adventures in History, where we talk history of Middle Earth. And this is, of course, not factual history, but it's super entertaining and interesting stuff, or at least I hope it is. This is what everybody asked for, right? So this is a fulfillment of a community goal where you, our viewers, spent 150,000 points of your hard-earned adventure point currency to hang out and talk history of Tolkien's Middle-earth. And that's what we're up to today. So I will note that I haven't actually used this particular setup since I have moved to my new computer. So I'm going to take just a second here and do a little bit of housekeeping, so that things are a little bit more straight and a little bit easier to read. Nope, that's the wrong one. Let's move this background here. No, not that background. I need this background, yeah. So let's grab that guy and we'll move him up just a little bit. Yeah. And then we will move this text up here just a little bit for our notes. That way everybody can see a little bit better. Yeah, look at there. Probably should have done that before I went live, and I do apologize that I'm having to tidy up the house. But we all know that hobbit holes get a little bit cluttered with all of the mathams that pile up. Now, if you're not familiar with what a matham is, it's the hobbit word for things that you collect over time that you don't really need, but you also can't find yourself getting rid of. Other people here in the States might call them white elephants, if you're familiar with that phrase. So yeah, welcome. Hope everybody is having a good one. If you donated to the goal of History of Middle Earth, thanks very much. And for those that might be just popping by, we are a very open and fun community, I think so. So if you have any questions about anything, or if you just want to just kind of throw some stuff there in the chat. If you have random questions about Lord of the Rings stuff or Tolkien in general, I'd be happy to answer those as well. So this is History of Middle Earth, and this is the 5th installment. We have had 5 of these so far, or 4 of these so far, which is a significant number more than I thought we would end up having, because just to be honest, I never thought we would make it this far at all. Let's just say that I wasn't 100% sold on the idea that my channel was going to be a big success. So had a little bit of the doubt there. So yeah, and we're talking Middle Earth, talking the history of Middle Earth. So anything useful to recap for this episode? Yeah, big crowds. That's actually a great question. We can recap quite a bit if you would be interested in. I can say that where we are is at the end of what we would call the Age of the Trees. This is a sort of a period of time where years are not measured yet, because the time is a little bit variable. The world as we understand it has been changed significantly from the beginning. The first Middle Earth was sort of perfectly balanced between 2 poles where there were big lanterns, and the bad guy, this guy named Melkor, whose name is Morgoth. He gets called Morgoth by this elven dude named Feanor a little bit later on. Morgoth ruins everything, and the world gets changed around, and then the Valar, who are essentially the gods of Middle Earth, have to rebuild everything, and they make a perfect place because they're waiting for elves. Elves did finally wake up, and the good gods found them. Also, the bad god found them, and the bad god twisted them and turned them into orcs, which is where the origin of orcs comes from. And the good gods were able to take most of the elves, not all, but most, to the Blessed Realm, and they lived there in peace for quite some time under the light of 2 trees. However, Melkor, the big bad guy, was very jealous of all of this and caused quite a bit of trouble, and managed to get captured. The gods captured him and chained him for 3 ages of the earth. And at the end of that, he was allowed to be released and acted like he was reformed. That was, of course, a bold-faced lie. And he begins to sow discord amongst the ranks of the elves in the Blessed Realm, especially with this guy named Feanor. I guess I can change text goes here to some of these people's names. So Melkor is the bad guy, the big bad. But Feanor is sort of the elf that is going to be causing a lot of the issue here, mostly because he is a very fiery person. His name is sort of accompanied with that. It means spirit of fire. And Feanor is a great craftsman of various sorts of goods and makes both armor and weapons, but he also makes the greatest creation of elves of all time, which are the Silmarils, these things here. And they are 3 jewels that captured the light of the trees, and they are amongst the most beautiful things that had ever been created. And of course, Melkor wants these and causes quite a bit of a stir, manages to steal the Silmarils, kill Feanor's father, and then escape over to Middle-earth. At the end of the last discussion that we had, Feanor had marshaled his followers, who are called the Noldor, and they had set off to chase Melkor. At that point, Feanor curses Melkor and calls him Morgoth, which is the elvish term for the black enemy. We will refer to him as Morgoth for the majority of this particular stream. So Morgoth is going to escape over to Middle-earth, and Feanor is going to go give chase with this big host of his elves behind him, having assumed the kingship of the Noldor after his father's death. And he's going to go up to a different group of elves called the Teleri. The Teleri were shipbuilders, and he's going to say, I need your boats, because Melkor/Morgoth has escaped over to Middle-earth, and I want to give him chase. And the Teleri do not give him the boats, so Feanor kills many of them, which is referred to as the kinslaying, which is a horrible event in the history of elves. But he takes the ships, and this is sort of where we left off at the end of History of Middle-earth Part 4, with Morgoth fleeing to Middle-earth and Feanor having possession of the ships to give chase. So, that being said, let us take a moment to perhaps refamiliarize ourselves with what the Middle-earth map looks like in the First Age. So if you are familiar with the map from Lord of the Rings, that map is thousands of years later, over 6,000 years later. And it is substantially changed from the way that Middle-earth looked at the beginning of what we call the First Age. So let us take a moment to get down a little bit of geography, which I know that everybody's favorite topic is geography. You came here for the history of Middle-earth, not necessarily for the geography of Middle-earth, but they go hand in hand, and I think this is a pretty cool map. So, plus, if you've hung around my streams before, you know that I really do enjoy maps. All right, so here we go. This is a map of what was Middle-earth at the time. And this looks very, very different than the way that it looks in later on the Third Age, where Lord of the Rings takes place. Also, The Hobbit takes place in the Third Age. So, the Blessed Realm of Aman over here is where the elves and the Valar lived. Along the shoreline here would have been a city called Alqualandi, where the Teleri, who are the ship-making elves, would have lived right around this place called the Bay of Eldamar. So Morgoth has taken his jewels up here to his stronghold, which is Angband, the Mountains of Iron. And Feanor is moving up the coastline here with his boats, giving chase. And most of our discussion today is going to take place in this region right around in here. This is referred to as Beleriand, and it is one of the more famous regions of Middle-earth. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in Beleriand, and most of this area is actually destroyed by the time we get to Lord of the Rings. Only some of this region right down around in here is still left, which is sort of part of the far reaches of the realm of Gondor, if you're familiar with Gondor. So Beleriand is where we are going to be focusing most of our discussion, and we'll pick up with what's going on with our big bad guy, Melkor / Morgoth, who is this guy. Now, again, if you have not been in the stream before for History of Middle-earth, I will say this is not an authoritative image of Morgoth or Melkor. I have looked for images that I think seem to fit, but there are not authorized images of most of these characters. So honestly, if you don't think Morgoth should look like this, that's perfectly fine. You are welcome to think Morgoth looks like whatever you want Morgoth to look like. Ooh, wow, what am I doing here? Wrong button. Sorry. So Morgoth, he's the big bad, right? He's the dark enemy. He's the evil guy that is still the Silmaril. He has stolen the Silmarils. He's going over, and he is going to meet up with two of his lieutenants. He's got a couple of people that are, well, they're not necessarily people. They're technically spirits called Maiar, who he has bound to his service. And one of them is this guy. This is Sauron. Well, this is a particular depiction of Sauron. So I know if you watch the Lord of the Rings movies, Sauron looks like a guy that's in big black armor, that's got big pointy, helmets and armor and spiky things, and wields a big mace and such. Sauron goes through quite a bit of change over the course of the ages of the earth. And in the first version, Sauron actually typically appears as kind of a wizard, someone that has a wide range of skills and knowledge, who is not unpleasing to look at. He's going to get himself in trouble later on, and that is going to end up causing him to sort of fix himself on the really negative, evil-looking image. So Sauron is, of course, one of the most trusted lieutenants of Morgoth, and he will go on to be the big bad in Lord of the Rings. But there's also this guy here, the big evil-looking dude with the fire mane and the axe and the whip here. This is Gothmog. And I know that sounds like a horrible title, but Gothmog is a name, and he is a Balrog. And we see here one depiction of a Balrog. This is by a pretty famous Lord of the Rings illustrator named Ted Naismith. Naismith has done quite a bit of work illustrating Lord of the Rings, and actually worked with the Tolkien family and the Tolkien estate for quite some time, figuring all of this stuff out and doing official illustrations. So where I can show official illustrations that had been commissioned by the Tolkien estate, I will show those and sort of give them a little bit of preferential treatment, because I feel like those might be a little bit more legit to the way that Tolkien would have actually meant for these things to look. So we have Sauron, of course, who is one of the big bads, and we have Gothmog. These are the two kind of lieutenants, I guess, and I don't know why my text is just going wonky here. It should stay within the little boundary, but it is not doing so. And that's being a little annoying, but, it is what it is. So Sauron and Gothmog, these are sort of the right-hand and left-hand men of Morgoth. And they had been busy. During the time that Morgoth had been sort of imprisoned over in the Blessed Realm, these two guys had been building up a giant army. And the army, of course, is full of orcs. Everybody knows what orcs are. Orcs are the bad guys. I'll eventually get this straight. I can't manually change that. I guess I can't manually change that. Oh well. Okay. Orcs, they're bad guys. Gothmog and Sauron have been building up a big army of orcs. And when Morgoth shows back up in Middle-earth, he asks them what's been going on. They tell him, look, we've assembled this giant army. And when these elves show up, we will be ready to meet them. And we will have all of the preparation that we need to basically attack them. But here's the thing. Morgoth goes, well, I don't really want to wait. There are other elves that are already here in Middle-earth. What about them? And there were quite a bit. So if we go back to our map, there were already quite a few elves. Over here in Beleriand, there were 3 big groups of elves. Over here along the coastline, there was a group of elves under command of a guy named Círdan, who was a shipbuilder. Here in the central part, there were a large group of elves called the Lyquindi, who were, in English, that would be green elves. And then over in this region, right around here, there is a big high king of the elves, in Middle-earth, a guy named Thingol. So Morgoth goes, why don't we try to get rid of them before these other elves, the Noldor, show up? And Gothmog and Sauron go, that's a pretty good idea. We should maybe kill the ones that are here, all right? So let's go take care of them. And they launch what is called I've lost my track. Okay, here we go. The first Battle of Beleriand. And I will eventually get this to the point where I don't have to keep doing this stuff. So this is going to be the first big battle between elves and Morgoth's forces. Now, there had been skirmishes going on quite some time. Sauron and Gothmog had been sending out orcs to sort of harass the elves that were in Middle-earth still, but there had never really been any sort of big, actual, scale-sized battle. But that's going to change. So the first Battle of Beleriand is particularly messy, and it goes, unfortunately, not so well for the elves in Middle-earth. And what ends up happening is that Morgoth is going to split his forces. He's going to send one big group over here to harass the elves that are along the coastline. And he's going to send another big group over here to harass basically Thingol here and Denethor, the leader of the Lyquindi that live in these woods right here in Beleriand. And this, of course, is designed so that they can't link their forces together and make one army. And things are going to go pretty poorly. So Círdan comes out of the havens and gives fight. I've got a photo of Círdan here. Here we are. Here's Círdan, or, what could be Círdan, of course. Once again, this is completely up to you, whatever you think Círdan looks like. He's a shipbuilder. He actually does show up in the movies at the very, very end of Lord of the Rings, Return of the King. He shows up as a very, very old elf, dressed very similar to this, at the Havens. They don't name him or particularly show very much about him. He sort of just stands in the background. But he does technically show up in the movies. And this guy is Thingol, who is the king, the big king of a place called Menegroth, the Thousand Caves. He had help from the dwarves to build this big palace that was underground in these big cave systems. So, we have a big battle. And Círdan comes out to fight the orcs. And it doesn't go very well for him at all. The orcs are going to wipe out a big part of his forces, and they're going to chase him back to his cities. And then the orcs in what we could call the Western Theater are actually going to lock him down and basically lay siege to the big city. So Círdan is unable to show up to help Thingol. So Thingol fights pretty bravely, but is also driven back into Menegroth, the Thousand Caves, where he has basically to endure a siege himself. So the king or the leader of the Green Elves, this guy named Denethor, is going to come out to try to help Thingol, and things are going to go pretty badly for Denethor. The Green Elves had never particularly been very big on warfare. They did not have very good weapons or armor, and the orcs pretty much wiped them out. And Denethor himself is actually killed. But this distraction and sort of the last sacrifice bravery of Denethor is going to give Thingol enough of a break to sort of sally forth out of Menegroth and rout the orcs up. Now, this doesn't continue. There's a lot of orc still moving around. Círdan is still pinned down. Thingol is in bad shape, even though he was able to defeat the force that was against him. Things aren't going so well. And instead of trying to go all the way across Beleriand to relieve Círdan, Thingol sort of makes a decision. And that decision is, we're going to go back home. And we're going to make ourselves some defenses. And so Thingol was actually married to one of the spirits, a sort of the word is Maiar. But his wife's name is Melian, and she was one of the Maiar. So sort of a demigod. And she and Thingol make a decision to basically cut themselves off. And Melian puts forth her power in what becomes known as the Girdle of Melian. And this is sort of an unseen hedgerow that confuses enemies. And if you try to kind of walk through this, it resists you and sort of makes you want to turn back, and it confuses you, and it sort of makes you walk in circles. Basically, if you are not given clearance, or if you're not a friend of the elves inside of the girdle, you are really going to have a hard time getting through it. And this was done in a very obvious and very aware attempt to basically try to keep the orcs out. And at that point, all of the land within the girdle becomes known as Doriath, which is the guarded realm. And Thingol is king there. Now, he does reach out to the Lyquindi, who had just lost their leader in Denethor, and says, look, you all come live with me. We're not necessarily the same group of people, but we're close enough. You come live with me. And a lot of them do. Now, not all of them end up joining with Thingol. Some of the green elves still sort of stay hanging around in the woods, but they are very few in number, and they really don't show up very much more in the histories that we are going to talk about as we go through this series. So Doriath has established itself. Melkor is a little bit upset with this. He had hoped to wipe out both forces of the elves prior to Feanor's group showing up. He's able to tie one of them down. Thingol is still very much there and is still a very big threat. So Morgoth is not particularly happy with this, but it is what he has. So let's switch back to Feanor. And this is a picture of what Feanor might have looked like. He was noted for his really dark hair and very piercing eyes. And here we see him holding one of the Silmarils. Clearly at this point he doesn't have any of the Silmarils because Morgoth has all three of them. and things are not going very good for Feanor and his group. So as they are sailing, they have killed their kindred. They have killed the Teleri and stolen the boats from Alquilanda, and they're moving up the coastline to sort of sail across the narrow part of the sea. Well, let me show you where I'm talking about. So again, they're sailing up this direction, and they want to sort of just hop across right here so that they can get over here to Angband. This is, again, Angband is the big line of mountains. Thangorodrim is this big trio of peaks that sit right above the underground layer of Morgoth. So they're moving up this direction so that they can sail across here in the ships and have an easy way across. But there's going to be some trouble. And that trouble is going to come from one of the Valar. Again, the Valar are the gods of Middle-earth, and one of them, named Mondos, is going to appear to these elves. Big Crowd says, where would the equivalent of the Shire be on the old map? That's a great question. Let me show you. So some of these figures are things that you would actually reference. Like if I put the map right about here and zoomed in a little bit, a lot of this stuff would be fairly recognizable. So these are the Misty Mountains. This is the Greenwood. Now, later on, if we sort of fast forwarded, this would be what we called Mirkwood. The White Mountains are where Gondor is, and right around here you would have the city of Osgiliath. I'm sorry, I'm losing my words. So Minas Tirith would be right about here. So all of this stuff is originally much more habitated, but in the world of the Third Age, this region is referred to as Holland. Right over here would be Rivendell. This is the Gap of Rohan. Isengard would have been right about here. So the Shire would have been right around in this region right here. There are some of these mountains that survive the changing of the world, but the ocean is basically going to swallow up all of this when they change the world over. So some of these mountains still hang around, some of these mountains still hang around, but the Shire would have been right around in here, right about this area. That's a good question, though. Of course, this area changes as well because Mordor would basically be right here. And then all of this area down here would have been Umbar, the Corsairs of Umbar that show up at the end of Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, come from this region, and the water is going to take all of this, basically. That's mostly because the Valar get really mad and wreck everything, though. So, speaking of the Valar, Mondos. Mondos is the Valar of fate and doom. And doom here doesn't necessarily mean, bad doom. It just means what is ultimately going to happen to you. And Mondos appears to Feanor and the elves, and he goes, look, you all are on what is essentially a suicide mission. I know basically everything that's going to happen, and this is only going to end in sorrow for you. You're never going to get these back. You are going to get a lot of things setting into motion that are not going to be able to be undone, and you're going to get a lot of your own people killed. And at that point, there are sort of three groups of the Noldor. And again, I should remind everybody that the Noldor are one of the three larger groups of elves. So there's the main group that is following Feanor, but Feanor has two half brothers. One of them's name is Finarfin, and the other one's name is Fingolfin. And at that point, Finarfin, who was Feanor's half brother, says, "Look, me and my group are going to go back to Amon. We don't want any of this stuff." So they actually turn around and go back to the Blessed Realm, and the Valar give them sort of a pardon. They say, "We recognize that you have understood that what you're doing is wrong. We forgive you for the stuff that you've done, and you can live here in peace." And Finarfin actually becomes the High King of Noldor in the Blessed Realm. Now, Fingolfin, who had basically gone through this whole thing where he had to prove his friendship to Feanor, is kind of wavering, right? This thing with Mandos showing up and saying, "You guys are going to screw a lot of stuff up," really gets him sort of uncomfortable. Fingolfin. Here is Fingolfin, or a picture of a person that could be Fingolfin. So here's the deal. Feanor is determined. He had sworn an oath in front of the gods that he would return or get his property back. The Silmarils would be returned. And he had all 7 of his sons swear the same oath. And he says, "I don't really care what Mandos is saying. We're going to go get our property back. We're going to go recover the Silmarils." And Fingolfin had not necessarily thrown completely in with the oath-taking stuff, but he had promised to follow the lead of Feanor, who was the High King. So Fingolfin sort of stuck in a middling ground. And a lot of the people that were following Fingolfin, that were sort of his household and his supporters, were also fairly uncomfortable with continuing after Mandos had said, "You should stop." So Feanor figures this out, and they have a camp on the side of the ocean. They've gotten off the boats. So Feanor decides, here's what we're going to do. We're going to wait until everybody goes to sleep. And Feanor and my supporters, all 7 of my sons and all of my people, we're going to take the boats and we're going to sail across to Middle-earth, and we're going to leave Fingolfin here. Because if he's not with us, then he's against us. And that's exactly what they do. They make camp. Fingolfin and all of his party go to sleep, and then they sail across. Now, at the region that they're sailing across, the ocean is very narrow. So they're sort of sailing across sort of right around here. And they make landfall right around over in this region. It's a place called Hithlum. And then they burn the ships. And they do this so that there's no way to go back. So this is sort of Feanor saying, "We're here. We're never going back until we get what's ours. Come and get it." See, here's the thing, though. When they start doing this, it makes, this big bonfire in the sky when you're burning all of these ships. And Fingolfin and his party wake up sort of in the morning, and they look across and they see the burning of the ships, and they realize that Feanor had basically left them for dead. Because, of course, they're not carrying a whole bunch of supplies with them, and there's not really any way for them to go back at this point. And the way for them to go forward is not particularly pleasing. So if we go one more time back to the map here, there's this region right here, which is called Helcoraxa, which is grinding ice. So this whole region right here is full of these big ice sheets that move around. They're sort of like really, really big icebergs. and they grind against each other, and they break up, and they move around. And Fingolfin says, I can't believe that they did this to me and my people, right? We had sworn to follow the command of the High King, yet he has betrayed my trust. He has abandoned us. And this really does hurt a lot of their feelings. This causes a big rift between Fingolfin and Feanor. And Fingolfin says, we've got to go. We've got to keep going. We have made a promise to try to help him out. If he's going to go recover the Silmarils, we have to do what we can to try to help. And in what is one of the braver deeds that gets recorded in the Silmarils, Fingolfin leads his party across the Helcaraxa, the grinding ice. So basically they go out onto these big ice sheets and cross what is essentially from iceberg to iceberg. And of course this takes an amazingly long amount of time, and many of them die along the way. So we'll put a bookmark right there, and we'll come back over to Feanor, because he shows up in Middle Earth ready to go. He is sort of loaded up. He's got all of his supporters with him. They have really crazy good arms and armor. And as soon as they step foot on the shores of Middle Earth, Morgoth hits them with a surprise attack. And this is referred to as Dagor Nuin Gileath. Dagor Nuin Gileath. Let me shrink this down a little bit. This means the battle under the stars. So Dagor means battle, by the way, if you haven't figured that out. Dagor Nuin Gileath. And Gileath, of course, should have just taken the Eagles. Big crowds. You mentioned the Eagles. The Eagles are not technically there yet. We will talk substantially about the Eagles we will mention one of them, and then we have a whole little moment at the end of the stream where we're going to talk about the Eagles. Yeah, you should have just taken the Eagles, right? It's just so much easier. You fly, you just drop the ring over there. Yeah, unfortunately, it just doesn't work that way. Okay, so Dagor Nuin Gileath. The elves show up. Everything is going so super great for them. And then here come all of these orcs. And the orcs are going to jump them, surprise them, and it is supposed to be this absolute rout, right? It's supposed to be Morgoth just sort of wiping these people out and destroying them completely. But Feanor is not to be trifled with. And his Noldor are the best equipped army that's on Middle Earth, period, at this point. And they start taking it to the orcs. And not only do they end up surprising the surprise attack by putting forth this really crazy level of defense, they end up turning a surprise attack into a rout, and then they start chasing the orcs back. And they wipe out almost all of Morgoth's army, and they get to the point where they are within sight of the walls of Angband. So they are just massacring and murdering and killing everything in their path, and then they get up to the walls of Morgoth's own fortress. And at that point, Morgoth is kind of like shaking, right? This is a bad spot for him to be in, because he really did not expect this whole thing to happen. And what ends up happening is that he releases the secret weapons. As the Noldor get within sight of Angband, Morgoth opens the crypts and the deep recesses and the pits and lets out the Balrogs. And of course, Balrogs are big and they're scary and they're horrible. And they're essentially trapped evil spirits that are on the same level as the Maiar. And the battle starts swinging back the other way. because these are as described in Lord of the Rings, the vilest and most deadly of all elf banes are the Balrogs. And the battle swings back towards Morgoth's side. Feanor gets sort of isolated. He and his bodyguard are basically kind of trying to charge for the gates to get inside, and he gets surrounded by a bunch of Balrogs, but he even kills some of them. So this guy is really crazy good at fighting. And he ends up going one-on-one with Gothmog. So it's Feanor versus Gothmog in this epic showdown. And Gothmog manages to wound him, but he doesn't. Feanor doesn't die. His sons show up kind of with the last force of the Noldor and drive off the Balrogs long enough to recover Feanor's body. So he is wounded to death, and he sort of understands that he is about to die. And his sons take him to an area that is not so far away, but easily defensible. And they kind of have this last moment together where Feanor says, I'm about to die, but you all have to carry on the mission. You all have to go get the Silmarils. This is now your duty to fulfill the oath and get back our property, because only the hands of the Noldor should ever hold a Silmaril. And you should never allow anyone to stand between you and the Silmarils, period. That's it. And his sons are like, okay, we got you. We're going to go get them. And when Feanor dies, this is sort of a very telling moment, that when he dies, his body sort of burns up. And when his spirit leaves his body, it's sort of like spontaneous elven combustion. And the spirit of fire leaves him and goes on to the halls of Mandos to contemplate. And we don't really know what happens to Feanor's spirit. So we haven't actually talked a lot about what happens to elves when they die. But very basically, their bodies are one thing and their spirits are another thing. So their bodies can physically die, but their spirits are basically eternal. And they go back to the Blessed Realm and are allowed to stay within a region that's called the Halls of Mandos. And they can reflect there for a time, and if so desired, they can kind of be reincarnated to live back in Aman. So Big Crowds ask, why do they care so much about the Silmarils? So this is partially because of Feanor's pride. So the Silmarils were very much the greatest and most beautiful creation of anything that had ever been physically created on Middle-earth. So they were like the best treasure that could ever be made. And they were the most beautiful things ever, and everybody was sort of in awe of these gems. And Feanor had sort of turned these into a symbol of his own strength and prowess. So when they were taken from him, that was sort of like stealing his thunder, or this would be akin to someone, breaking into the vaults of the United States and stealing the Constitution or stealing the Declaration of Independence, like Nick Cage did. Right. So this is basically stealing the best thing that they had. And of course, because Morgoth had it, this was the evil of the world holding the most beautiful things that had ever been created. And to Feanor's mind, this was kind of it was about as much of a sin as you could commit. So getting this back was amongst the biggest and most important things that he thought that he could do. So Feanor's dead, and his sons are left to figure out what to do. And it's at this time that Fingolfin and his party are going to get across the Helcaraxa and manage to step foot onto Middle-earth. So at this point, Fingolfin has no idea what's going on. He doesn't know anything about the battle. He doesn't know anything about Feanor being dead. He doesn't know how bad Morgoth's troops are. He doesn't know anything. He just knows that his people are essentially exhausted after this incredibly arduous task that takes, well, we don't really know exactly how long it took, but somewhere between weeks and months to cross this basically this hellscape of ice. And so they show up and they're like, okay, we're here, cool, maybe we can take a breath. But they can't take a breath because Morgoth had one final army, and he had actually sent this army around to try to get behind Feanor. So as Feanor was pressing towards the walls of Angband, Morgoth had sent this army up in sort of a flanking maneuver to try to get behind Feanor so that he could capture the elves between a host of orcs on one side and the Balrogs on the other side. And when Fingolfin and his party show up, they run square into yet another band of orcs. This is going to be called the Battle of Lamath. Or if you want to say it, Dagor na Lamath. The Battle of Lamath. And Fingolfin is going to get blindsided by orcs. This, of course, though, is the last real army that Morgoth has. His first army was mostly defeated with the first Battle of Beleriand. The main host of what was left of that army was then defeated at Dagor Nuin Gileath. So this host, this last army, is basically it for Morgoth. And Fingolfin is of the Noldor. So Fingolfin and his people are armed and armored in the same way that Feanor was. And so they start kicking the orcs' butt too. The issue here is that when they arrive, it really does take them completely blindsided. And at this point, Fingolfin's son is actually going to die in this sort of crossfire. And this is going to really be a sticking point because had Feanor waited or brought Fingolfin and his group with him, Fingolfin's son would not have died. So Tekman asks, also, were not the gems crafted from some of the essence of the former two trees that the Valar made? Yes. So when Feanor was making the Silmarils, there were 3 of them, and they were gems that had many facets, but they were shaped in globes. And he had actually crafted some of the light of the 2 trees into these gems so that they shone with both golden and silver light. So they also had within them very basically the power of light and earth and creation inside of them. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second, because things are transpiring back in Amon, or the Blessed Realm, while all of this other stuff is happening too. So Fingolfin's son gets killed, but this only sort of manages to enrage Fingolfin. And did they have usable power? Like, could you basically turn them into a battery? Yes, but to get at that power, you would have probably had to sort of use them up. So, in the last history of Middle-earth, we talked about what Melkor did in order to steal the Silmarils. He and this big monster spider thing called Ungoliant had attacked the 2 trees. So the 2 trees were basically the thing that were giving light to all of Middle-earth. And when they attacked the trees, the light went out. And this, of course, plunges basically all of Middle Earth into darkness. And this is the darkness that Morgoth uses to sneak into the vaults of Feanor and steal the Silmarils in the first place. So Feanor was at a big party, and when the trees... he was at a big party hanging around with the Valar. They had invited him down. And they said, we could probably save these trees if you would give us the Silmarils. And the Valar basically said, look, give us the Silmarils, we will take the light out of them and use that power to restore the trees. And Feanor was like, forget you. You're not getting my gems. You are not getting my stuff back. You have... At that point, Feanor had been exiled for basically pride. And he's like, you're not getting my stuff. Nobody can get my stuff. So, yes, they did have power within them, but to use that power would have almost certainly either diminished them or destroyed them. So, Feanor was not necessarily interested in giving them up. Think of it this way. The last... Techman is getting ahead of us, but yeah, we'll talk about that in just a second. Feanor, proof that pride is dumb. Yeah, KP, there we go. Pride goes before a fall, right? Okay, so Fingolfin and his hosts are in this battle of Lamath, and things are going bad initially because of the death of Fingolfin's son. But the host of the Noldor are enraged. They slay all of the orcs, and they push all the way up to the gates. And at this point, the hosts of Morgoth were effectively gone. Like, he had kind of no more orcs, and even the Balrogs were in bad shape because of the assault of Feanor and his bodyguard. So here's a brand new entire army of Noldor. Do you send out the last of the Balrogs, or do you just sort of keep the door shut and hope they leave? But what's interesting is that Fingolfin literally goes up to the gates of Angband and starts banging on them, demanding that Morgoth show himself and fight. And Morgoth doesn't. He sort of like sits back and tries to figure out what's going on. And then something weird happens. A big light appears in the sky. And that really freaks out Morgoth and all of his agents, and they just like, oh yeah, we need to figure out what the devil is going on before we go out and do anything, because it's light outside again, and we can't go do the light stuff. But that's okay, Techman. We are there right now. So the Great Lights. So while all of this battle and all of this war is going on over in Middle-earth, the Valar are not sitting on their hands. They are trying to save the trees. And three particular of the Vala are going to try to put forth all of their skills in healing and to try to save what's left of the trees. And Yavanna, who is essentially the goddess of all plant growth and life, is going to be sort of leading these efforts. She was the one that had initially spurred the creation of the trees to begin with. Nienna, who is the Vala of sorrow and mourning, is going to basically cry over the trees. And then you have Vanna, who is the ever young. She was sort of the Vala of youth and springtime and energy. So all three of these female Vala are trying to do whatever they can to save the trees. And it's not going to be enough. However, the trees do have a moment where they seem to perk up a little bit, and Telperion, who is the silver tree, has one big flower that blooms, and it glows pretty brightly. And Laurelin, who is the gold tree, uh, produces one big fruit that they pick. And at that point, they have these two items, and these are giving out a pretty great deal of light. And then in comes Aula. Aula is the craft god, the god of smithing and the god of creation and things like that. Here's a picture of Aula. This is unfortunately where he's trying to kill the dwarves, but we all know that he didn't actually kill the dwarves. The dwarves were spared. The dwarves, by the way, are not sitting all this stuff out, but they don't necessarily have a pretty big stated role in a lot of these battles with the Noldor yet, because they don't know who the Noldor are. But the dwarves are there, and they will show back up in just a little bit. So what ends up happening is that Aula decides, I know what we can do. I will make these two big vessels, and we will put the fruit on one, and we will put the bloom or the flower on another, and then we can set them up to basically fly around in the sky. And you already know where this is going. This is the sun and the moon, or the great lights. And the task of these vessels are given to two of the Maiar. Tilion and Arion. So Tilion is this guy. He's a male Maiar. He is given charge of the blossom of Telperion, and he sets sail first. And the big light that pops up in the sky around the Battle of Lamoth, when Fingolfin and his host are fighting the big bad guys, is the moon. History was written by the elves. Proof? ? Dwarves are afterthoughts. Oh, yeah, that's not necessarily so wrong. Of course, for the longest time, the elves are the only ones that really have any concept of recording history. The dwarves' language is very complex when spoken, but they don't really have a written language for quite some time. It's not for a while before they start making runes to record stuff. And even then, the runes themselves are not necessarily widely used for writing histories. They're mostly used for things like inscribing who made this thing. And the dwarves would very frequently use the elven letters or the elven alphabets. So when we get to the part of Lord of the Rings where they are in Moria and they find the Chamber of Marzabul, which is a big chamber of records, and they find the Tomb of Balin, they find this big book, and the book is written in elven script because that's what a lot of the dwarves wrote in. Now, the stuff that's on the tomb is actually written in the runes. And if you are a really big nerd like me, you went to the appendix at the end of Return of the King and learned how to read the runes. So you can read that. There's a little inset in the book where you can actually read the runes that are on the Tomb of Balin. How well known was the history of Middle-earth to the Lord of the Rings era people? Quite well. And there are people inside of the Lord of the Rings that were alive during this period. So I guess most notably would be Círdan, who is a lord of the elves even before the elves go over to the Blessed Realm in the first place. So he shows up. He's mentioned in the Lord of the Rings several times. Again, he does sort of kind of show up in the movie. Also, Glorfindel If you're familiar with the way that it goes in the story in the book, in the movies they basically cut Glorfindel out completely and replaced him with Liv Tyler because they had to give her enough scenes to justify giving her a high billing in the movie. But it's Glorfindel that actually finds Strider and the hobbits on their way to Rivendell, and it's Glorfindel's horse that Frodo rides into Rivendell. The horse's name is Asphalloth, by the way. But Glorfindel is a Noldor. He's one of the first elf lords. He came across the sea with them. Galadriel is one of the original Noldor. She is in the host of Fingolfin. So Galadriel actually went across the Helcaraxa and managed to survive. So, and by the way, it's noted that Tolkien himself sort of said that Galadriel is like one of the best of the Noldor. Like she's sort of one of the apex Noldor that ever exists. So that's pretty cool. So this history was not forgotten. Now, people like Elrond, who is widely considered to be the master of lore, had not at this point been born, but he is born during the First Age, which is why you hear him in the movie go, 3 ages of man have, or 3 ages of the earth I have seen. And he's talking about, the banners of Gil-galad and Anarion and all these people because he was there. So that's a few streams ahead of us. But yeah, this history would have been accessible. Now, how many people knew that is a different question. So people like Celeborn and Galadriel, who are the Lords of Lothlorien, would have known all of this stuff. There were a lot of really big highborn elves that would have known all of this stuff. But even people like Bilbo, when they get to Rivendell, Bilbo is trying to work out this song, right? When they show up and they have the big feast where Frodo sits beside one of the dwarves, sits beside Gloin, one of the people that went with Bilbo on his adventure. And, then they go into the big chamber of fire where they are going to sing a lot. Bilbo is making a song about the First Age, about Erendil, who is Elrond's father. So, yeah, I mean, they knew this stuff, but it wasn't pretty common. A lot of this stuff in the average life of a human in Middle-earth would probably have been gone. There may be a couple of humans that knew about this stuff. Maybe Denethor, the steward of Minas Tirith, who had pored over a lot of the scrolls, knew some of this stuff, but not many humans would have known this. Aragorn probably had a pretty good grasp on it. Hobbits would have known basically none of this. The hobbits had basically fallen out of even the reckoning of the wise. So this is why when you see them show up at places, people are like, wait, I've heard a song about that, but that song is like just a rhyme or a goof. I didn't know these things actually existed. So the hobbits would have not known any of this, except for maybe Bilbo. And maybe Frodo or Sam would have heard him talk about some of these stories. And it's pretty clear, though, now that I'm thinking about it, that Sam knew some of this because there's a conversation when Frodo and Sam are climbing up the big stairwell, and they're kind of coming down into Mordor after they've passed Cirith Ungol. And Frodo and Sam are talking about like how the stories of the big adventurers never really end. They just sort of change into the new one. And Sam points out that some of the light that's in the phial of Galadriel that Galadriel gave Frodo comes from the light of the North Star, which becomes, it's basically Ariandel that gets... I'm getting ahead of myself. Some of this, but not a lot. And I could ramble about that for a while, and I've already rambled about that for probably 5 minutes when I didn't necessarily mean to. But that's the risk of asking an open-ended question to a giant Tolkien nerd like me. So let's talk about the sun and the moon. now that we're almost there. Okay, so Big Crowds, I hope that answered your question. I probably answered it way more than I needed to, but there we go. Okay, so this is Tilion. And again, he is given control of the vessel that holds the flower of Telperion, and this becomes the moon, and Tilion rises first. And this is actually fairly important. It doesn't necessarily seem like it might be important that he rises first, but Telperion was the oldest of the trees, and it had given forth its light first. So the fact that Tilion in the moon vessel rises first is significant. It's also significant because as the first children of Iluvatar, the head god, the elves are always going to have basically more of a feeling of being drawn to the moon. And this is going to show up later on when they start working stuff and they make like Ithilden, the stuff that is used to make the keyhole on the Lonely Mountain that only shows itself at the right time where the moon shines upon it. The same sort of thing happens when the company of the Fellowship of the Ring comes to Moria and they're looking at the doors of Moria. That's written in Ithilden, which is basically Mithril that has been enchanted to show up in moonlight. So the elves are going to always feel this sort of kinship with the moon because it is the older of the two lights. But then we have, you shall have camels, horses, an armed escort, provisions, desert vehicles, and tanks.
You're welcome.
Well, Batbird, thank you for the bits. It's very much appreciated. You've missed quite a bit. A bit. We're talking about the creation of the sun and the moon right now. And we just made the moon out of a big flower that came from a tree. And this guy, whose name is Tilion, is going to be the captain of the moon vessel. And this beautiful young woman, whose name is Arian, is going to be the pilot of the solar vessel, or the sun. And what's interesting about Arian and the sun is that if we took a lot of the Valar and sort of polled them and said, who is the most powerful of the Maiar? So the Valar, again, are the head gods. The Maiar are sort of like the demigods. Who is the most powerful of the Valar? I'm sorry, the Maiar. Arian would have been in the top 1 or 2. She was widely considered to be one of the brightest and strongest burning of the spirits. She had taken the form of a woman, but when they say, look, we're going to give you this vessel to sail through the sky, and we want you to use the power of the fruit of Laurelin to kind of get this going, she basically gives up her human form and fully embraces this giant fire form, which is brighter than Tilion could accomplish holding on to his form, but this is also why the sun is brighter than the moon. And one thing that is notable about Arian and the sun is that because of her sort of reputation of being super strong, a lot of the evil beings fear her presence. So if you're familiar with The Lord of the Rings, or if you're familiar with The Hobbit, you'll know that some of the really, really bad stuff, like orcs and trolls, have a big problem hanging around in the sun. In fact, Arian's power can turn a troll to stone. This happens, of course, in The Hobbit, where the trolls are debating how they're going to eat all of the dwarves. and they get caught by the dawn and turned into stone. Well, that is because Arian cannot abide this evil and actively seeks it out and tries to throw her power upon it. This is also why a lot of the orcs can't run around during the sunlight, which is also impressive because when we get to Lord of the Rings and you have the Uruk-hai, the braid of orc that Sauron creates, they can run during the day. They don't mind the sunlight, which is particularly scary because orcs aren't supposed to dig the sun. So that's a pretty big deal. But Arian and Tilion are going to be the sun and the moon and the sun, respectively. And Tilion sort of has a thing for Arian. He kind of thinks that she's super beautiful and wants to be near her. And that's one of the reasons why the moon seems to stray a bit. And sometimes the moon shows up in the same sky as the sun, and sometimes the moon even comes very close to the sun and blocks it out, which we would call eclipses. But this is Tilion trying to get close to Arian because he is in love with her. This also explains, by the way, the concept of the man in the moon, because Tilion is a male spirit and very much does live in the moon. It also explains the dark patches on the moon. So if we look at the moon, it's got pock marks and stuff. That's because it gets too close to the sun sometimes, and Arian, being this brilliant spirit of fire, burns the moon with her radiant beauty. So this is basically Tolkien explaining how the sun and the moon exist and how they work, and giving it a logical, meaningful backstory, if you will. But this is an important and auspicious moment. Not only does the appearance of the moon and the sun completely freak out Morgoth and his few remaining soldiers, this is going to mark the beginning of what we call the First Age. The First Age. So prior to this moment, there were not years. Time was measured in things that were maybe called years, but they were variable in length. So you had these ages. You have the age of the lamps, which was the first age on Middle-earth. Then you have the age of the trees. I guess even before the age of the lamps and the trees, you had the age of darkness, where there was nothing and they were just working in dark. But this begins the First Age, and this begins year numero uno. So from this point forward, we're actually going to be able to keep up with years, which I know people hate because I teach history and people don't like remembering dates. But we can actually do that now, and we can remember stuff like how old is this person, and how frequently did this happen, and how long ago did that happen, as opposed to this thing, and yada, yada, yada. All right, so First Age has officially begun with the rising of the sun and the moon. It's a pretty cool stuff so far, right? I think so. Now, here's what's going to happen. At this point, our big bad, Morgoth, he is freaking the heck out. Because let's just be honest, the gods are very much literally watching him now. They have put stuff in the sky so that they can watch him, and so that his movements can be seen and observed, and he can no longer hope to hide in pure darkness. This doesn't look good for him. So he decides to kind of punt, if you will. He sends an emissary to Maedhros. Maedhros was the oldest son of Feanor. And Maedhros... Nope. There we go. Here is an image of what Maedros might have looked like. Again, if you don't think this is what Maedros looked like, go for it. I actually quite like this image. Maedros did have this sort of bright red hair, and of course was decked out in all this really cool armor and such. So Morgoth sends word to Maedros, and he's like, look, man, we need to have a parlay, right? And if you've seen the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, you probably know exactly how this is going to go. You don't really call a parlay unless you were on the back foot, if you will. So Maedros gets this this invitation to a parlay with Morgoth, and right away, all of his other brothers and all of the other elf lords are like, this is a trap. It's a trap! Don't friggin' go to this. You should just ignore it, leave it alone. And Maedros is like, well, I think we could maybe just kind of counter-trap him, right? So if we know that it's a trap, we can go into it expecting for it to be a trap, and maybe we can spring a trap on the trap. And people are still like, no, this is just a bad idea, don't do it. And so Maedros is like, look, I'm in charge now, Dad is dead. Right? So Maedros is claiming to be High King of the Noldor. And he says, we're going to go, and we're going to plan, we're going to plot, we're not going to get caught with our pants down, we're going to beat him on this. It doesn't go very well. Even with showing up with way more numbers than he's expecting, Morgoth shows up with even more, and Balrogs. And Maedros gets taken captive. And this is pretty bad. So now we have 6 sons of Feanor who get an emissary from Morgoth that says, how about this? You all pack up and leave, or I'm going to kill your brother. And they're like, we're not ever dealing with you again. Like, you are a liar, you are a cheat, you are horrible. We are never, ever, 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 ever dealing with you again. And Morgoth is like, all right, fine, I'll just kill your brother. And they're like, we don't even believe that you'll kill him. And Morgoth didn't really want to kill him. He wanted to torture him and get all of the information out of him. So here's what happens. He takes Maedros and he basically tries to torture him and get whatever information that he can. And Maedros won't break, which is pretty impressive because Morgoth is like the big bad, right? He's the boss at the end of the game. And Maedros is just a guy, but he's a stout dude and he withstands this torture. And so I'm sorry, the puppy is here and she's upset that I'm not paying her more attention. Maedros endures, and so Morgoth says, here's what I'm going to do. If you won't tell me, I'll just let you watch what happens. And so he takes Maedros up to the top peak of Thangorodrim, this big, giant mountain, sort of sharp-peaked mountain that's at the very top of the Chain of Angband. These are the mountains under which Morgoth has his big bad meeting place, or his lair, if you will. And he chains Maedros by the arm, just one arm, and leaves him hanging from the top of this mountain. No food, no water, just leaves him up there hanging. And that's pretty rough. So for a long time, for almost a year, the elves that are in Feanor's son's party really have no idea what to do. But eventually, Fingolfin and his party are going to find the sons of Feanor. And there's a lot of beef because of what Feanor had done. He had abandoned them, he had burned the boats, he had forced them to cross the grinding ice, he had put them in a position where they got sidetracked and waylaid, and this caused the death of Fingolfin's son. But Fingolfin was willing to put this aside to a certain extent, but he said, where is Maedhros? And so the rest of the Noldor tell him, like, he got captured by Morgoth and he's being held prisoner. And this is when one of the cooler stories of the entire First Age happens. So Fingolfin's son is a guy named Fingon. And Fingon and Maedhros were cousins, and they had been really, really close. So close that they were almost brothers. So Fingon hears, and by the way, here's a depiction of Fingon. You see him wearing a crown, which is a little bit of a spoiler for the future, but it's a cool picture, so I chose it. So Fingon decides that he is going to go get his friend back. He's going to go get his cousin back. And so he starts on a solo mission, by the way. So this is like deep cover elf, spy mission kind of stuff. He goes into the darkest dungeons, and he starts trying to find Maedhros, and he starts climbing all over Angband, the chain of mountains, to try to find Maedhros. And eventually he spots him, and he is looking up the side of this big peak, and at the top of this peak of Thangorodrim, he sees Maedhros hanging there, still by one arm. And this is, again, by this point it had been months. Right, so we're almost coming up on First Age year 2 at this point. And Maedhros was still hanging on, and that's a bad pun, but he was still up there, and he was still alive. And Fingon is sort of heartbroken because he could not see a way to climb this mountain face. It was basically the sheer mountain face, and there was no handhold to be found, and there was no way to get all the way up to the top of this mountain to get his cousin back. So Fingon does something that is kind of a shot in the dark, and he calls out to Manwë. Manwë was the leader of all of the gods on Middle-earth. He was the wisest and the one that knew the most about what was going to happen in the world. And he says, here's the deal. I need help. I know that our group has sort of betrayed our trust. We have killed our own. We have abandoned the Blessed Realm. But look, I'm asking you as someone that loves this dude hanging up here, like, could you give me something that would help me save my friend? And it says in the Silmarillion that Manwë heard his cry, and he sent Thorondor. Thorondor is the king of the eagles. And this is sort of the first appearance of the eagles in anything. And I found this really great picture that I'll share with you here. So Thorondor shows up and finds Fingon, and then flies him up the side of the mountain so that he can free Maedhros. Now, the problem is that the chain that Morgoth had used to chain up Maedhros was such craftsmanship that it could not be broken. So Maedhros says, kill me. Just kill me. But Fingon won't do that. He says, I can still save you. And he chops his wrist and chops his hand off. And of course that allows his arm to come out of the chain. And then Thorondor flies Fingon and Maedhros back to the elves. And at that point, there is a moment of reckoning, because here is one of the people that was on the side of Feanor and Maedhros that had abandoned their family and left them in dire straits and burned the ships so that there was no way to save them. And yet here's one of the ones that had been left behind, that had to cross the grinding ice, that had to endure all of this hardship, that had to watch his brother get killed. And they have now formed this bond. That they had the bond to begin with, but now it's even deeper because you saved me. And there's a big meeting between the basically the sons of Feanor and the host of Fingolfin. And Madras says, look, here's the deal. We were wrong. We should not have abandoned you all. We should not have left you to die in the wilderness. And Madras gives up the title of High King. So Feanor had been High King. When he died, Madras had assumed that title, but Fingon was his uncle. I'm sorry, Fingolfin was his uncle. And so he gives the title High King to Fingolfin, and Fingolfin becomes the High King of the Noldor. So that goes a long way towards healing the rift between the groups of the Noldor. And at that point, they start kind of splitting up all of the territory. And here in Beleriand, they start creating their own little kingdoms. And Fingolfin is around over here, and the seven sons of Feanor sort of stretch through this direction. But they come into contact with Doriath. Again, Doriath was the realm of Thingol, the High King that had never gone to... Well, sorry. He had gone to the Blessed Realm, but his people had not. He was the lord of the elves that had stayed in Middle-earth. And when they come into contact with each other, there's a little bit of friction. Because the sons of Feanor go, oh, look, elves, and look, a kingdom, and look, these are potentially friends. And they go to Thingol and they say, will you join us? Will you take on this charge to help us recover the Silmarils? And Thingol goes, I don't want anything to do with that. I don't want to get in your oath. I don't want to get under this doom that Mondos has basically just said is going to happen. Like, look, if you all do this, bad stuff is going to happen. Thingol is smart enough to know not to get involved with that. So there's a little bit of a tension there, especially between some of the brothers of Feanor and Thingol, because Thingol is very clear, like, look, I have already established the boundaries of my territory. You all can't have my territory. Stay out of my land. You go do your thing somewhere else. I am not interested in getting involved in all of your fighting. Just leave me out of it. Well, that, of course, hurts some feelings. There are some kind of nasty words exchanged. But at the end of the day, that's what happens. So this continues to grow, and for the next 18 years, so the big meeting where a lot of this stuff happens is in First Age Year 7. This is when Fingolfin becomes the High King. But in First Age 20, they have a big meeting. And they have this big, basically, kind of come together meeting of all the elves in Middle-earth. They invite everybody. If you are an elf living in Middle-earth, you are invited to this meeting. And all of the sons of Feanor show up. So some of the sons of Finarfin show up. Fingolfin shows up. And ambassadors from Thingol. So even though he has sort of barricaded himself into his territory, he recognizes that, he does need to maybe be at least aware of what's going on. So he doesn't come himself, but he does send some ambassadors to this. And what they do is basically say, look, we are all enemies of the one enemy. We need to at least be friendly with each other. And the rifts that existed between the sons of Feanor and Fingolfin are completely healed. and they kind of patch things up with Thingol, at least to the point where everybody is going to be constantly in contact with each other and constantly involved in sort of planning and plotting. Now, Thingol again is still Lord of Doriath and in the guarded realm, and he's not going to really be that big of a part of the big battles that are going to happen in our next History of Middle-earth. But he very much is aware of what's going on. Now, I mentioned eagles, and I mentioned specifically Thorondor. Let's have a moment where we talk about the eagles. And this has been something that we've talked about a little bit in the past. If you have been in some of the History of Middle-earth streams, I explained this a little bit directly as why couldn't they have just flown the ring to Mordor? Let's actually talk about what the Eagles are and where they come from. So the Eagles are a rock band that were really popular in the 60s and 70s and to a certain extent the 80s. I'm just joking. So the Eagles are actually just animals. Now, a lot of people assume that because the Eagles can talk, that they are some sort of higher being. Hey, Afagaj, I'm glad I got you with that one. So, because they can speak and because they have intelligence, there's some sort of theory that maybe they're Maiar. Maybe they are some of these lower level gods. And maybe that's what they are. But they are not. They are just really intelligent animals that learn the speech of elves and men because Manwë said so. Now, Manwë is the god of the wind and the god of thunder and such like that. And he is going to bring the eagles into being. He's going to craft them and make them, and he is going to be the one that teaches them how to speak and teaches them how to understand and think and plan and do all of that stuff. And he sends them to Middle-earth with two purposes. They go to Middle-earth, number one, to watch the bad guys. So the original meeting place or the original eyrie of the eagles is on top of Thangorodrim, the big peaks where Morgoth has made his his armories and his pits and his throne room and such. So they literally sit right on top of him. And Manwë made the eagles in such a way that they could see everything happening on the surface of the earth. And this is something that Manwë had as well. Manwë had the power to witness at any point that he wanted any activity that was happening on the surface of the earth, regardless of whether or not it was day or night. So he's given this power to the eagles so that they can watch this stuff. They can literally watch and report back. And that's one of their most important duties, is to watch Morgoth, to see where his forces are moving, how things are, moving around, how things are happening. He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows when you've been bad or good. So don't kill your family members on the shores of Alqualandi and steal their boats for goodness sake. Which brings us to the second purpose of the eagles, which is to watch the Noldor. Because even though the Noldor had gone against his expressed wishes, and even though the Noldor had killed their own, even though the Noldor had not even turned back at the last warning of Mondos, Manwë still cared for them. Which is why he sent the eagle to help Thorondor. He sent Thorondor to help Fingon rescue Maedhros in the first place, because he still cares about them. They're still the first children. The whole reason the Valar went down to Middle-earth in the first place was to take care of the children of Iluvatar. So Manwë knows that this stuff is going on. And at the moment, here in the First Age, Manwë still has a little bit of grace towards the goings-on in Middle-earth. That is not always going to be the case. By the time we get to the Lord of the Rings, Manwë's mind had changed. There had been a lot of stuff that happened. So to put this into perspective, the first age is 389 years long. All right. The second age is 3,441 years long. And the third age is 3,021 years long. And the stuff that's happening in Lord of the Rings is like the majority of the action that's happening in Lord of the Rings is happening in 3019 and 3020. Right? Which is about, what is that? Almost 7,000 years later. So there has been a lot of history between what we're talking about right now and Frodo. 7,000 almost years of history and goings on. There's going to be a lot of stuff that happens between what we're talking about and where we get there. And in that period, I don't want to spoil all of the stuff that happens. I want people to be interested enough to either go read the book and figure it out, or come back and watch History of Middle-earth Part 6. But Manwë's opinion changes of what the Eagles are supposed to do. The Eagles would not have taken the ring to Mordor. Even if all of the free people of Middle-earth had begged them, Manwë would not have allowed the Eagles to do so. The Eagles do not have what the people, they don't have a soul. So the word in Tolkien's, I guess, writing is Fea. They don't have a soul. They have a body and they have an intelligence, but they don't have a soul. They aren't really free to do things on their own. They don't have the flame imperishable. They don't have what we would call free will. They're sort of really intelligent and really cool looking tools that Manwë makes to carry out his will in Middle-earth. Manwë would not have allowed the Eagles to carry the ring to the pit. It just would not have happened. And now I know most people don't know that. You know, most people don't read the Silmarillion. Most people aren't hanging out here with, you know, us folk talking Lord of the Rings. But it would not have worked. It just would not have happened. So, there's a little bit of a spill about the Eagles, and I hope that sort of clarifies any questions about how the Eagles worked and who the Eagles were. But, before we leave, there is one more thing to mention. Upon the rising of the sun, when Arion first leads the solar vessel into the sky, in the far east of Middle-earth, around this area over here, the first men wake up. Men are the second children of Iluvatar. Oh, that's streaming there. Their forecoming had been long told. The Valar knew that they were coming. The Noldor knew to expect the coming of men. But here's the thing. When men first showed up, hey you're finally awake. Right? Did you miss the alarm? You've only missed like the last 3 ages of the Middle-earth thing. You missed all the cool stuff in the dark. You missed the stars. You missed the lamps. You missed the trees. But you show up when the sun shows up. I guess whatever. It's better than being completely late. But here's the thing. When the men show up, they're so far over in the east that nobody really knows it. The Valar do not know it. The elves do not know it. But somebody finds out first. And I think we all know who finds out first, because he's also the one that figured out that the elves were awake first. And that is Morgoth. So Morgoth finds the men, and stuff happens from there. But that is where I have planned to end my portion of this edition of History of Middle-earth. I know that it's on a cliffhanger because we just got the second children showing up, and hey, there's all this cool stuff that could happen now. What's going on with the men? How are they organizing themselves? What's going on? Where are they coming from? What are they going to? That's all for later. We'll come back to the men. However, if you are interested or if you have questions, I would love to entertain any sort of questions that you might have about this material or really any other. Where did they come from? They came from way over here in the east again. So if we're looking at where most of the stuff happening today is going on, we're over here in the region of Beleriand. The men are going to show up over here somewhere in this area. Around Cuiavanen, which is where the elves first woke up. So somewhere over here in the farthest east, maybe over here in Hildorian. And they're going to start moving, but that's... where did they go? I see what you're doing here. Where did they come from? Where did it come from, and where did you go? No, you're good. You're good. I appreciate it. All right. No. Never apologize. It's all good. It's all good. Does anybody else have any questions? Anybody have any sort of weird Lord of the Rings angle or question that you want to throw out there? I'd be happy to answer any of this stuff. I am a gigantic Tolkien nerd. And if you haven't figured that out from just hanging out in the stream today, I don't know how else I could really prove that to you. But, yeah. If you want to read any of this stuff, by the way, you could read this in the Silmarillion. This particular... like, all of the stuff that we just talked about is in the Silmarillion. And all of the stuff that we've covered so far, if you buy the book called the Silmarillion, you will get the history of all of the stuff that we have covered so far. It's not all in one big... technically, if you buy... let's say you go to Amazon, you buy a copy of the Silmarillion, you're actually getting 5 books, or 5 stories. So the Silmarillion is the third of those. It's the longest one. But we have covered the stuff that's in the first 2. The first one is the Ainulindale, which is the creation of the universe. The second one is basically just all about the Valar and their types and what they did. The Silmarillion is where the story really kind of kicks off and going. And you get other stuff like the Akalabeth that's at the end that talks about men, and we'll talk about that in a lot of streams in the future. Is there an audiobook? Yes, there is an audiobook of the Silmarillion. And there's a really good one. I can't remember who reads it. But I was very impressed. Let me see if I can Google that. And see if I can figure out who was the person that narrated it. Ba-dum-bum-bum. It seems like yes, Martin Shaw. There is a Silmarillion audiobook narrated by Martin Shaw, and it is excellent. He had clearly gone to the lengths that it takes to learn how to properly pronounce all of the Lord of the Rings names, or all of the Elven names and all of that stuff, which is a bit of a task. So you have to read a lot of the appendices, and it doesn't hurt if you do some vocal coaching. But yeah, he pronounces all of the names correctly. It does a really, really good job of it. And I had such a great time listening to the Silmarillion. Martin Shaw is the narrator there. Oop, wrong one. I was trying to type his name here. Martin Shaw. So yeah, go check out that one. It's really good stuff. I apologize, Martin, for forgetting your name. I don't know if I still have that one or not. I'm sure I have it on a hard drive somewhere. It's pretty long, though. It's a substantially hefty audiobook, but the text is rather historically dense. The Silmarillion is written effectively in historical style. So if you read the Ainulindale, it's actually written genre-wise as a creation myth in the same sort of language and style that you would see if you read other creation myths. So when you get to the Silmarillion, it's written like a history. So it's actually a history text, which is part of the reason why I probably like it so much. But also the reason why a lot of people could get turned off from that, because it is very dense. And I don't mean that like as an insult. It's just chock full of terms and names and stuff. And you've got to keep up with, all of the sons of Feanor and all of the people that are doing this, and who's Finwë, and now there's a guy named Elwë, but Elwë changed his names to Elu, but Elu then takes on the title Thingol. So is Elwë Elu Thingol, or is Elwë Thingol is what I call him. I tend to call people by the names that they end up with the last. Unless I'm telling the story, then we talked about Elwë and how he changed his name to Elu Thingol and all that stuff, and what all that meant. But yeah, so it's really good, but I like it. And it's kind of hard for a lot of people to get their heads around all of that stuff, though. I have not done this lightly, right? I read the Silmarillion now probably 9 or 10 times and listened to it on audiobook at least twice. So, giant nerd. All right, anybody else? Anybody else have any questions? I realize that there are a lot of other people streaming right now, and I wonder how many of those people would have normally been here had they not been streaming while I was doing this. And I'm not trying to say that it's their fault or anything. I'm just saying, like, normally there'd be a lot more people in the room. But that's okay. I think we had a good time. I had a good time. All right. Seeing no questions, let me wrap up History of Middle-earth Part 5. Thanks, everybody, for hanging out, having a good time. I am going to be back around definitely on Tuesday night. Maybe a little bit early. I might actually kick off Tuesday stream a little bit early to try to get some extra time. We're talking about some pretty deep topics. We'll be talking about the history of the state of Israel, which is very much involved and has a little bit of a need to be specific and accurate. So I might start a little bit early so that we can just have a little bit more time and not feel rushed. But I will definitely be back on Tuesday for the history of Israel as a state part 2. And then we'll be back on Thursday for our regularly scheduled adventure in history. And we'll be talking about the War of Three Kingdoms in China. So yeah, that's what is coming up in the world. But I think we are going to go do a raid. And we're going to go raid I Am Batbird, who I only learned today is a streamer. So we're going to take our party over to I Am Batbird's party, and we'll just we'll have a good time over there. But thanks, everybody, so very much. I appreciate you for hanging out. And if you are not already following, you can hit that follow button and get us one step closer to having another one of these episodes, because I do one of these every 100 follows. So I am about 4 or 5 follows away from having 600, which would trigger another one of these happening. So if you're not following and you enjoyed it, you can click that follow button and get us one step closer to having another one. Otherwise, I will see everybody around. I hope you have a good one. So take it easy.